Good afternoon and welcome to Blossomburg Cemetery. Blossomburg Cemetery certainly is not one of the oldest in the county, nor is it a pioneer cemetery, but it has been in use for over 100 years. No story of cemeteries would be complete without telling you about Blossomburg, because many people think it's one of the most beautiful in the county, especially in northern Door. The cemetery was a part of the life of the early settlers. The people who first landed on the other side of the rise came from Norway in 1850 and hoped to make a settlement on the shore. They built a sawmill and they built a schoolhouse, but the winds from the north came hurtling down and made it so uncomfortable that they decided to move to another direction. The cemetery is now in use by the Gibraltar Township and has been for many years. For one thing, people who come from urban areas seem to like it because it epitomizes all the qualities of Door County that they cherish. It's quiet, it's tranquil, it's unhurried, and it's natural. Blossomburg is not even a historical cemetery because it was never under the auspices of any religious body, and it's been primarily for Gibraltar Township. When the Andersons landed, there was a family of George and Martha Anderson, and they came and wanted to settle here. And when they bought the property, it enclosed all of this cemetery, and they believed that part of this was used as a family cemetery. And when the wind came hurtling down, they too moved up on the bluff side to have their farms. There was a man called Ole Klugland, an early settler, who decided to call that area on the shore Blossomburg, which in Norwegian means windy mountain. That name in American parlance became Blossomburg, the name chosen for this cemetery because it seemed to fit most appropriately and the people preferred it. Now the Anderson family decided to sell a part of the land to the township, and I'm happy to say that there are two great-grandchildren here today who come from that original Anderson family. One is Neil Anderson, and the other is his sister Joyce Anderson Meyer. Now the cemetery have boasted a few graves before 1890 when she sold 2 acres to Gibraltar Township. And her sons also sold a part. They were Andrew, Henry, and John. And the price of the property was $100. Now in 1951, the township made a purchase of 1.9 acres from Peninsula State Park because the park by that time had acquired all this property. Then in 1954, the township and the state exchanged some land so that they could define the boundaries more carefully. There were 14 grave markers here before 1890. And one of them was 1881, and that grave was for Libby G. Churches. Her husband was quite a prominent businessman in Fish Creek, and he represented the township on the county board for many, many years. Now, Peninsula Park is comprised of many thousands of acres, and so it was a wonderful thing that Mrs. Anderson sold this property to them. And it's a noticeable thing as you come. There are no fancy gates. There are no places that say this is a cemetery. But you come over Mengelborg Rise and suddenly you see a clearing in the forest, and then you see a great expanse of green with native trees in their natural surroundings. There were 14 grave markers, as I said here, before 1890, but now the list has grown to a greater number, and many of those graves marked the people who were prominent in Fish Creek in northern Door County. One of the best known, perhaps, is H.R. Holland, who was an author of many books of history as well as any other subjects. He died and was buried here in the cemetery in 1963. Today we thank the Township of Gibraltar for preserving this lovely area in its natural surroundings. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Julia Duklin. My husband, William Duklin, was the lightkeeper at the Eagle Bluff Lighthouse here on this peninsula for 35 years. I was born on Mackinac Island in Michigan. My father, Ambrose Davenport, was the lightkeeper there. My mother, who was the daughter of a Chippewa Indian princess, was called Ojimagwe Susan de Carreau. Her father was a French fur trader. I had 5 sisters and 6 brothers. I was number 8 in the family. When my husband-to-be he grew up in New York State and he served in the Civil War. He was wounded at Gettysburg, and when he got out of the Army, he enlisted in the lighthouse service. And his first assignment was to come to Mackinac Island and to be the assistant to my father. So that's how we met. When we were both 22, in May of 1867, we were married. Our first little boy, Ambrose, was born about a year later, and our second little boy, Albert, about a year after that. But Albert, God rest his soul, died, and he's buried on Mackinac Island. Then William was assigned to Beaver Island, Michigan, so we moved there. And in the next 11 years, I had 6 more little boys. William Jr. and Frank and Charles and Joseph and James and Walter. When William received his assignment to come to this lighthouse, Ambrose, our oldest, was 14, and Walter, our youngest, was just a year and a half. You can imagine how delighted I was after living on an island all of my 30-some years to come to this peninsula. There were about 30 other families living here at the time. We could go into Fish Creek or into Ephraim to shop and to go to church. We could have company. It was wonderful. I was very happy. And the house that we moved into here was the same plan used by the Lighthouse Service many other places, but it was a wonderful house compared to what most of the people on the peninsula were living in. It's a brick home. It has 7 rooms. It has 4 stoves, including one in the upper level, which was very rare. It has a big cellar that they blasted out of the rocks to have plenty of storage space, because I'll tell you why we needed that later. There was a summer kitchen, so that when I was doing the hot work of summer, laundry and canning and so on, I didn't have to start up a wood stove in the house and heat that up. We had a barn and an oil house eventually, and a brick privy. We got our water for laundry, we collected in a cistern from rain pipes on the roof. And our well water, for about the first 20 years we lived there, we had to carry up from the bay on a rather steep stairway, but that was a good job for the boys. And then about 1900, we got a well outside of the kitchen door with a pump. But we never had any water that came into the house, and we never had any kind of facilities for the water to get out of the house, and we never had electricity or a telephone either. You can imagine all the baking I did for this family of growing boys. Lots of bread and cakes and cookies and pies and things. I also did a lot of sewing. I think my memory's correct that one Christmas I made them all a suit, so I made 7 suits. And I made my husband's uniforms according to very particular directions that the Lighthouse Service handed out. My thing that I was famous for was crazy quilts. I made them out of fancy materials like velvet and brocade, and never with rectangular shapes, always with interesting other shapes. That's why they're called crazy quilts. And then there's embroidery around each piece. I won awards at the Door County Fair for them. And as the boys were married, each bride got her own crazy quilt. And as my 19 grandchildren arrived, each grandchild got a crazy quilt too. We didn't live near a school until finally a school was built here on the peninsula. And by then, Walter was about 12 years old, so I taught the boys at home. And I wanted them to have an interest in music, as William and I did. So we made sure that they had musical instruments. The story, maybe some of you have heard about the piano we ordered from the Chickering Company in Boston. It was a baby grand, and they sent it out by boat, and we paid $50 for it. And when it arrived and we hauled it up to the lighthouse, it wouldn't fit in any of the doors. So it had to go back to Boston, where they had another style with a shortened keyboard and removable legs. So they sent that out, and that is still in the lighthouse. And the nice thing about that was because as the boys became so proficient, they formed a family band. And if they were going to play someplace where they didn't have a piano, they could take the legs off of ours and put it on their sleigh or put it on their wagon and take it with them. The lighthouse service sent an inspector several times a year. He would be unannounced, although we'd watch for his boat and run around and try to slick things up. He did a Navy-type white glove kind of inspection. So he wasn't only inspecting the lantern room and the lens to be sure they were free of soot, which William took care of every day, and the windows of the lantern room, but he was checking my housekeeping too, and our grounds as well. So the whole family was involved. There were 13 lighthouses in Door County at the time, so there was great competition because the inspector would hand out little certificates for the best lighthouse. So it was very competitive. We were especially competitive with the Brown family that was manning the Cana Island Lighthouse, because they had 7 boys too. And my boys, who were not angels, I must admit, and the Brown boys did get into some fights that even made it into the Door County Advocate, I'm sorry to say. We had lots of wild game and fish and a garden, of course. And I was busy preserving things. It was a busy time. But we had lots of company. In the wintertime, we didn't have to man the light from about near the end of December to April because there'd be ice on the bay. So that was our time to socialize. And then we could go over the ice, too, which was a pleasant way to get to town or to see our friends on Chambers Island. In the summertime, the job wasn't quite so bad because you didn't have to light the light until it got dark, and you could put it out as soon as it got light. It was in the fall and the spring that those were very long days to tend the light. And then after you turned it out in the daytime, then William would have to clean the lenses and the windows and so on. He was able to man this lighthouse until he was 74, partly because of the help he got from our boys. Charlie and Edith, after they were married, lived with us for a while. And Walter and Gusty and his first 2 little children lived with us for a while, too. So that's why William was able to man it. And, of course, the Eagle Bluff light is built up on a cliff, so you don't have to climb quite so high up to get to the lantern room as if you were on the Cana Island light, which is built down at water level. So when William was 74, we built a little house in Fish Creek. It's just, he wanted to be able to see the water. It's just a door down from the summertime restaurant. And stepping out of character for a minute, I'll tell you that Julia died there in the house at the age of 77 on September 20th, 1922, of heart failure.
Well, my parents were both born in Germany. My father came over to America, and because he had some cousins over here in Chicago, and he liked it and he decided to stay. And he got a job with a company that was had money in, it was English money and Scotch money in American farms, and he worked for them for quite a while, and
uh, eventually became the president of the company, and they built a lot of buildings in Chicago. And one day, my mother was walking in the park, in Lincoln Park, and she met a gentleman who was German, and they started talking. And he said, "Well, tomorrow I'm going to Door County." Mother said, "Where's that?" And he explained it and said, Fish Creek is a little village there, and there's a nice place. There are a lot of German Americans from all over come there and have wonderful dinners and spend the summer and go swimming, walk in the park. You'd love it. That's how come we first came up here. And we came by train, no cars. All we ever did here in Fish Creek was walk and swim and eat. Wonderful food. And my dad finally liked us so well, he decided he'd buy some property, and couldn't find anything in Fish Creek that was available that he liked. And we had some friends that actually was my music teacher. She was Swedish, and her husband was German. They had bought a place in Ephraim, and they said there's some beautiful woods right north of our house. I know you'd like it. So we came, looked at that, and that's where we live now, where I live. Just love it. And I live here all year round. I don't go to Chicago at all anymore, or Milwaukee.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Gertrude Howe. I am the granddaughter of Alexander Noble and Marie Campbell Noble. Grandfather was one of the very early settlers in the Fish Creek area, and he came to Fish Creek in about 1855. He and his wife Emily raised 3 children. You might have met my Aunt Beulah Noble last year at Bayside Cemetery. She was quite a trailblazer. And Emily died, and grandfather remarried. He married Marie Campbell from Bay Settlement, and they had 4 children: Gertrude, Nellie, Robert, and Alexander. Nellie finished her schooling in Fish Creek, and then she went off to Dixon, Illinois to secretarial school. And she finished and got a job in Chicago with the Harvey Firestone Jr., and that's where she met Donald Howe. They were married in 1909. They had 2 children, my brother Donald and me, Gertrude, named for my mother's sister. I was born in 1913. Well, Donald and I had a very wonderful childhood. We would go to school and head Chicago in the wintertime, and then in the summer we would come up and stay at Grandmother Noble's. And we fished and swam, picked cherries. One day Amanda Schreiber came over with her 3 children and got me, and we walked up the Fish Creek Hill to the Green Orchard, which is now George DeFore's place. And I earned $2.50 one day. And Ed was old enough, he could work too, but Bob was just a pesky little brother, and Helen was just a toddler, so Amanda was busy just watching the children. And Vivian Duclon and I would go fishing, and one day we didn't have a fish hook. We used a safety pin, and we caught a fish. And then my teenage years, I remember babysitting over at the Thorpe Hotel with my friend Evelyn Thorpe. Well, I was always a very good student. And after high school, I went to the University of Illinois. I got my bachelor's degree, graduating Phi Beta Kappa. My brother Donald had gone to medical school. He was a surgeon, and I decided I was going to medical school. This was not something women in the 1930s did, but I was a trailblazer like my Aunt Eula, so I went. I got my MD, University of Illinois. Then I went on to get my residency at University of Cincinnati. I came back to the University of Illinois and taught for a few years, but then after the war, Donald went up to the Polyclinic at Sault Ste. Marie, and so I joined him up there. And Donald had married and had 4 children, and that's where I got my nickname Choo Choo. I think the children couldn't say Gertrude or Trudy, so they called me Choo Choo. Well, I did something else that women didn't do at that time. I took flying lessons and I got my private pilot's license. I was now able to visit patients that were a little farther away, and I was also able to fly from the Sioux directly to Ephraim, come back and visit my family. My father had died in 1954, and mother had settled back in the family house in Fish Creek. Well, I wasn't content with what I was doing up at the Sioux. I wanted to do more, so I heard of an excellent program out in California. I went out to the University of California and I got my master's degree in public health. And I came back to Wisconsin and joined the Wisconsin Department of Public Health as the director of the Maternal and Child Welfare Department. There had been a survey that showed that the Wisconsin infant mortality rate was very high, and I wanted to do something about it. I met with Dr. Stanley Graven, and he and I set up a program where doctors would go out to areas in the state and see what the problems were and what we could do to solve those problems. Dr. Bud Barta, a very successful pediatrician in Madison, was one of our early recruits. Well, I was the outspoken, as Bud Barta would say, aggressive person, and I was the fundraiser. I was able to get this money to keep this program going. It was very expensive, but I felt well worth it. And I will say it was a success. Within 10 years, we had that mortality rate dropped 50% just by the good care that we had instituted and were giving to the women and the babies. Well, now in the 1980s, I'm coming to my retirement years. I'd always visited Fish Creek, and now I decided I'm going to live there full time. So I came back and lived in the same house that I had such pleasant memories as a child, and where my mother had come, and now where I was going to live. But never wanted to just sit. I joined the American Association of University Women. I joined League of Women Voters, Historical Society of Gibraltar, the Fish Creek Women's Club, and I was a member of the Norador Bridge and the Norador Book Club. Some of you might have played bridge with me. It was quite a group. And then I would invite these women to my home during raspberry season, and I would serve fresh raspberries from my very own garden. Well, I had a saying that every person needs 7 hugs a day, and I think I got my quota from all the children that I've taken care of over my many, many years. Dr. Howe died of pneumonia in 1995. She was 82 years old.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm C. Alexander Lundberg. I own the store at the bottom of the hill. My name is C. Alexander, but you may call me Alex. That's what most everyone calls me. I'd first of all really like to introduce you to my wife, Alice, but she's not able to be with us this afternoon. Alice is quite a lady. She is a very devout Christian, a Baptist, like we all are. When we were first married in 1885, there was no church here in Fish Creek, and she wanted to start a congregation, and she did. But there was no money for a building. So she and some other ladies got together and began making and selling quilts. And through those sales of quilts, they raised $3,450. And that was enough to build the Baptist church over on Cottage Row. That church was Alice's pride and joy. But she had a lot of sadness in her life, too. She gave birth to 5 children. However, little Ruth died at age 14 of tuberculosis. And Robert died at age 6. Our other 3 daughters, though, brought us much joy. There was Gertrude, who taught school here at the Blossomburg School, and then she married and went to Kansas City. Then there was Lucille. Lucille was a home ec teacher and lived most of the time in Milwaukee, but everyone here in Fish Creek called her Honey. And then there was Alma. Alma was a nurse, and she married Dr. Waldo and lived in Oak Park, Illinois, most of her adult life. That was our family. Now I've got to tell you about our store. I started out as a cooper making fish barrels like my father before me, but pretty soon I decided that I would try being a seaman. So I traveled up and down the bay in steamships, and I tired of that rather quickly, and in 1881 I entered the mercantile business by buying a little store on Judd Harbor. Not long after that, I built the store here in Fish Creek. Our store did very well. We did a good business in spite of the fact that the Hill family, who owned the pier and also the shipping business, built a general store right next to ours. So there were two general stores side by side. Now I want you folks to know that it was not our store where they had the dances in the upstairs part. That was the Hill store. Alice would never have tolerated that. And it was also in the Hill store where the men sat around that big stove in the center in that big box of sand so that the place didn't burn down. The men would always spit their tobacco juice into that sand, and it got to be an awful mess. Mrs. Hill always complained about that. So the Hill store was really the social center for the village, but our store was the communication center. You see, we had the only telephone in town, and there were lots of calls that would come through for the folks who had places up on Cottage Row. If the call was real urgent, Alice would make sure it got delivered right away. But usually she just remembered, and then when the folks came into the store, she would tell them what the message was. To help her remember, she'd write little notes on paper and pin them to her dress. Sometimes the notes read things like, "Mr. Murdoch, you have a telegram from Peoria," or "Mrs. Crutchins, your son in St. Louis wants you to call him." Things like that. Sometimes neighbors would come in and read the notes pinned to Alice's bosom and carry the message back to Cottage Row to their friends there. We built our house on Cottage Row. It was way down. It was the first house on Cottage Row. And we lived there and were a part of the community for many years. We were a very strong part of the community. My good friend Alex Noble, whose house is right across the street from our store, and I often talked about the fact that so many interesting things started and happened here in Fish Creek. For example, you all know this area as Blossomburg. That's because of all the pretty flowers that grow here, right? No, not at all. That name came from a man whose name was Ole Klugland. Now, Ole was not a happy man. Nobody ever saw him smile. He was a pettifogger, kind of a lawyer, and he sued everybody in sight. In his heyday, Ole would have to travel by sailboat up and down between Fish Creek and Ephraim. And oftentimes, as he came around the bluff, contrary winds would catch his boat, and then he would look up at that old bluff and scowl, and he'd spit out Blossomburg. Blaasenberg. Blossom means windy, and berg means mountain. So Windy Mountain is what Ole really named this area. Over the years, it got softened a bit. There was no snarl in it, and it's now Blossomburg. And did you know that Fish Creek is where people started jumping into the icy waters of the lake? That happened back in 1879. A Seventh-day Adventist revival preacher came through town, and he convinced a lot of people of the value of Saturday worship. At least 34 adults from Fish Creek followed him into the waters of the bay on May 1st. It was a very late spring that year, and the bay was all full of floating ice. Now that, my friends, was the first polar bear club in Door County. I was a pillar of the community, if I do say so myself. My books were always very circumspect, and I always voted Republican, as any right-minded person would. A lot of times people came to me and wanted me to run for office, but I always declined because I was much more interested in developing the business community. And that's what I did, and that's my contribution to this community. If I can step out of my role for just a moment, I would say that the church is now called the Community Church over on Cottage Row. The Lundberg House is still there, and it's part of the White Gull Inn complex. Alex Lundberg, as you see, lived till 1925, and he died in the home of his daughter and Dr. Waldo in Oak Park after a very short bout with pneumonia. Alice, on the other hand, lived until 1956 and died at the age of 93. And for many years, she kept the store going as a store.
I'd like to welcome you this afternoon. I'm Hjalmar Holland. There are three things I'd like you to eventually remember about me as you would be leaving. And the first is that at a very early age, I felt a calling to observe and record events of history. And that eventually led to a career as an author. And secondly, the part of history that was always most intriguing for me was that of studying the very early pioneers to this part of Wisconsin, particularly those who were of a Scandinavian ancestry. And third, I don't think anyone ever questioned my deep love for Door County, the land, the water, and these hard-working early pioneers. I was born in 1872, a few miles east of Christiania, Norway, and both of my parents had backgrounds of farming families who had a considerable amount of land. My father planned to take an early retirement, sold 3 of our farms, and made some very poor investments in some tenement buildings, and we experienced a financial disaster. And so, for a hope of a better life, when I was age 12, my family moved to the Chicago area, and there I was educated. Eventually, I went off to the University of Wisconsin in Madison and graduated in 1898, then stayed on for another year and got a Master's of Art degree, and immediately was offered a fellowship at Columbia University in New York City at the wonderful sum of $600 a year. But I turned it down. Because that last year in school I had been doing a little extra research on the side and go to the university library, and I came across some documents that were recently filed by government surveyors. And it was concerning a part of Wisconsin called Door County. And I was captivated by the fact that it spoke of these precipitous bluffs that rose 200 and 300 feet above the shoreline. And so upon graduation, I went to Door County to see for myself. And I so fell in love with this area that immediately I purchased a piece of property of 200 acres near Ephraim, and then set about having an apple orchard planted. And it was the first commercial apple orchard in northern Door County. But to tell you the truth, I didn't do that much of the work of that orchard, but I hired others to do it. where I had been watching some of these hard-working farmers and persons in the orchard, and their days were so long and they were so tired at the end of the day they didn't have time for anything else. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't that I was lazy, but I was a big city boy from Chicago, and I preferred working inside and writing. Then I became a traveling salesman and went throughout the various little towns in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. But wherever I went, I always took my notebooks. And so that gave me an opportunity, when the day's work was done, to interview some of these Scandinavian families. And eventually I gathered those notebooks together and compiled a 2,000-page handwritten manuscript about the history of the Norwegian immigration to this country. In the worst way, I wanted to have it published, but I didn't have the money to do it. So I went to Chicago and contacted a Mr. John Anderson, who was the editor of the Scandinavian newspaper, and with fear and trepidation asked him to loan me $2,000 so I could have 1,000 copies of the book published and hopefully sell them for $2 apiece. I just wanted those folks who had worked so hard to be able to read in their own language about their accomplishments so they would know that they would never be forgotten. And Mr. Anderson agreed. And then before long, I got up enough courage, went back, and asked him for another $2,000. But he encouraged me to take out a larger loan and to have 3,000 copies printed. And eventually 10,000 copies of this book were published and sold, and another 3,000 in Oslo, Norway. Now that gave me then the idea to do the same thing about interviewing people in Door County, and so in 1917 had published a book entitled The History of Door County. Eventually, in all, I wrote 12 books. 4 of them were specifically about Door County, and I think that attests to my love for this area. Perhaps the book that people will remember most is the old Peninsula days that have gone through many, many editions. And I know there have been some who have accused me of never letting the facts interfere with a good story. But I want to assure you that I was most sincere in writing this book because I wanted to, as best I could, make these characters come alive and to let others know what wonderful contributions they had made to Door County. But I suppose the book that I really liked the best was my last book. I got around to writing it at the age of 80, and at 85 had it published. And I entitled it My First 80 Years. And it gave me an opportunity to simply write about my personal feelings, about a number of experiences I had had, and particularly my travels in Europe, and my family and my friends. And as I came to the close of this experience, I found it very satisfying. I want to share with you just 2 brief paragraphs from the prologue to the book. I wrote, having reached the age of 85 years, I think I understand the situation better. 80 years is not a great age, but a mature one. It is a good point of observation from which to view the vicissitudes of life and evaluate them objectively. An age of tranquil reflection and the vision of informed intelligence. It's the best period of life. I am therefore looking forward to my second span of 80 years with keen anticipation. The foolishness of callow youth is forgotten, and the unwise ambitions of early manhood have long passed away. Now I can meditate on the countless miracles of nature with reverent enjoyment. I have leisure to renew my friendships with the great characters in literature and history, and I may even write some little things of my own. With good health and a clean conscience, life is most enjoyable beyond the 80th milestone. And also I was privileged in 1900 to marry Lillian Teresa Ingersoll, who was a teacher, graduate of the Teachers College in River Falls, Wisconsin, and we had 4 children: Harold, Ivor, Swanhild, and Wahlberg. Again, I have been blessed with a long and a good life, much of it spent right here.
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Schreiber, the wife of Lester Schreiber. Lester and I met in Marinette across the bay. He was a tie inspector for the railroad, and I was working in a restaurant. We married in June of 1913, and a little over a year later, we had a boy, Edward, and we thought our life was complete. But then in 1915 and 1916, the railroad began laying off men, and Lester was one of them. So there we were, with no income coming in. But by a stroke of luck, at that time, a letter came saying the Fish Creek General Store was for sale. Would we be interested in buying it? Well, that would be a lot for us to take on. We thought a lot about it. But we were young, and we were both used to doing hard work, and it sounded as if we could remodel the upstairs of this store and live there, so we wouldn't have to buy a home or to rent one, which we were doing then. So we bought the store and moved to Fish Creek. The store had been neglected for a number of years, so it was dirty, and there was also a very strange smell in it, probably due to the cats that had been allowed the free run of the store for some years. There was a pot-bellied stove there, and of course we would be keeping that. But the one thing that we were not going to have was all the idle men in town who came in every day to sit around the stove and tell their endless stories and spit tobacco juice, which sometimes didn't hit its mark. So we got the buckets of soapy water out, and we began to scrub and scrub and scrub. We scrubbed the floor 3 times on our hands and knees before we were sure it was clean. And then when we were sure that everything was fresh and clean in the store, we ordered in our goods and opened the store. The first day that we were open, we took in $1.35. That was kind of discouraging, but we opened the store the next day and the next and the next, and gradually more and more people came in as they found a nice, fresh, clean store. Lester took 3 jobs outside of the store at that time so that we could pay our bills and make our payments. So that meant that I was in the store quite a bit. With a lively little boy, that was quite a challenge. We did one thing that was very wise. Lester walked down Cottage Row and took orders from the cooks. And in 1916, there were quite a few cottages on Cottage Road. So he took the orders, walked back, he built a 2-wheeled cart, loaded the orders on it, and walked down and delivered them and came back again. That was a lot of walking. We did have one very bad year in those early years. It was in the fall, and we'd ordered up all of our goods for the winter to come up before the bay froze. It was to come up by boat from Green Bay. That boat sunk, and with it all of our orders, and with it our spirits, because we didn't have any insurance. So all we could do was reorder again and work a little harder. Not that everything was hard work and despair or discouragement. We had many good times in those early years, many good memories of those days. We made friends, and although we didn't dance, we played cards, and there were lots of card parties that went on in Fish Creek in those days. Also, Lester loved cars, I think, from the first time he saw one. So when we could scrape together a little extra money, he bought a Saxon car. And every Sunday we went out for a drive in the Saxon car, picking up his brother Hollis and Hollis's wife Ella. Well, every Sunday the Saxon broke down somewhere. So Ella and I got in a lot of good visits while the men climbed out and looked under the hood, got under the car and tinkered around. You know, cars were a lot easier to fix then. You could tinker a little bit, or with a little wire, you could fix them and go on your way, which we always made at home. In 1920 and 1922, we had 2 more children, Robert and Helen, and that completed our family. Then in the mid-1930s, Lester acquired a nickname. One night he got up in the middle of the night, and for some reason, he looked out across the street to the house, across the street, and discovered that their garage was on sale. The garage was a separate building. So he marshaled all the men in town, organized a bucket brigade, and they fought the fire as well as they could. But they could only hope to contain it because there was no fire engine in town. We had to wait for one to come from Sturgeon Bay. They must have helped, though, because the buildings in the close proximity that were in danger of being on fire were saved. But the village did realize that they needed a fire engine at that time. So they ordered one, and when it came, they asked Lester if he would be the first chief of the Fish Creek Volunteer Fire Department. He served for over 10 years. And after that, in the family and close friends, he was called chief. As the children grew into their teens, they all worked in the store. And the store was open from 7 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, Monday through Saturday. Later we opened also on Sunday morning. And of course in summer we never got out of there until 11 o'clock at night. Then as Lester's health began to fail, the 2 boys, Edward and Robert, took over the store. And the store was in the family for over 54 years. Lester's roots went very deep in Fish Creek and Door County. Both sets of grandparents were pioneers in the county. He had a great deep love for Door County. He was a quiet man, but he also had a great pride for his beautiful Door County and Fish Creek. I'm so glad we had this beautiful place to lay him to rest. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. William Schneeberger, and I'm glad you came here to my final resting place. It was a beautiful day in October 1969 when I finally got to rest. As a country doctor, you know, we're busy all the time, and I was always on the go. Never, even after I retired, could I have a time to rest. People kept rapping on my door, hoping I could lend a hand. And I never could say no. I had 2 years, however, toward the end of my life where I really wasn't well. And with a lot of pain, I was really looking forward to this time of rest. And so this is a special occasion for me when you gather here with me today. In my early life as a doctor, I had some really good times while I was working. I enjoyed my work a lot. I went to medical school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and then to Rush Medical College in Chicago. And I practiced for a while in Orfordville, right near Janesville, and then I practiced in my hometown of Racine. Finally, though, I heard there was a need for a doctor in Ephraim, and in 1921 I came here to Ephraim. I was 35 when I came. I met Dorothy in Sturgeon Bay, and we were married, and she was a wonderful help in my practice. You know, she's a registered nurse, you know, and the 2 of us made a really good team. We enjoyed working together, and we had an office right in our home. It was upstairs, so people came in the front door, through the living room, and up the stairs they went to the office. Our home was in a good location, right behind Wilson's ice cream parlor, so everyone could find us. We had 3 children. There's William, who's been resting there for a while, even before I died. And then there's Robert and Mary Lou. And I have 7 grandchildren. I sometimes wondered about raising children in the midst of a practice like ours. You know, we really never had enough time for the kids, and I worried whether we were slighting them. And then they had all of these people who were sick proceeding through the house. And I wonder if they got kind of a jaded view about life because everybody they saw was sick. Well, I guess they survived and they did okay. I really had a love for beauty, and I had a great picture in my office. It came from an old, huge calendar. It was a picture of Marilyn Monroe. My wife and I had an argument about that. I thought it ought to be out on display, and she thought some of the patients wouldn't appreciate that so much. So after the argument, we decided that we would hang it on the inside of the closet door. And if I had a patient that I wanted to share the beauty with, I could just go into the closet for something, and we could enjoy it together. In the summertime, tourists came to our community, and they had special problems. I had a phone call one night from my friend Ted, who runs the Ephraim Hotel. And he told me a guest had just arrived from Chicago to stay for a week. And he just had gotten there, and he put on his swimming suit and ran down to the pier and dove in. He didn't know that the water was only 1 foot deep. So Ted wanted me to come right away, and I grabbed my bag and went down to see him at the hotel. His neck wasn't broken, fortunately, but he was so badly bruised, I wrapped him carefully, and then I told him that you must stay in bed for a day. He didn't follow my orders, though, and the next day he was lying in the sun all day. That night, Ted called me again. You have to see this same patient. He's so badly sunburned, and I took my ointments along and applied ointments on this patient and said, this burn is so bad, you must stay in the room for a few days. And after 5 days, he decided he couldn't stay there any longer, and he put on his swimming suit and went down to the pier. And this time he jumped in instead of diving in, and he bent his ankle so badly, he really thought it was broken. It wasn't broken, he was fortunate. It was just badly sprained, and I wrapped it tightly and said, you have to try to stay off of that now. Well, on his 7th day, he was heading back to the bus, and I heard that he fell. Fortunately, he didn't have to call me for that fall. But somebody heard him mutter, I'm never coming back here again. There were surprises with local patients, too. In the early days of doctoring, most didn't have a phone or had electricity, and most didn't have a car. And sometimes someone would come with a horse and call me to come to a faraway place, and I'd hitch my horse to the wagon in the summer or to the cutter in the winter to go over the snowbanks, and I'd follow that messenger all the way to the sick person. And I could usually help out a little, and they usually paid me $1 for a call. And sometimes it was only payment in eggs or tomatoes, but that was okay too. The people surprised me very often, those who were patients. One time I was dealing with a very gruesome case, and there were some people watching, and 3 of the bystanders fainted. All of a sudden I had 4 patients on my hand at the same time. I really enjoyed my doctoring and meeting people. It was a good way to live in Ephraim. And I really didn't expect anything more of it, but I was really surprised by the Ephraim community. For in 1965, the people voted that I would be the chieftain at the Fear Ball, the first year we had it. And I got to ride in the lead car of the parade, and when we got to the end, I insisted the driver double around, and I could watch the rest of the parade go by, and I saw the whole shebang. It was really fun to hear the applause of my friends, but the real reward of being a country doctor was really twofold. First, people came with their deep human needs. They told me their stories, and I listened to their troubles, and I listened about their sickness. And then secondly, sometimes I could do things that would help them. And that's really a reward, to be so satisfied with one's work.
Good afternoon. I am Annie Roy Olson Thorpe. My parents were Rochelle and Orlando Olson. I am the second wife of Roy Thorpe. I was born October 25th, 1866, and died on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1948. Now I'm going to tell you mostly about my husband Roy because he was kind of an interesting character and he has many stories in his history. He was born November 29th, 1855, lived until 1933 and died at the age of 78. He had come from a long line of ancestors who were very early pioneers on the Door County Peninsula. Roy's parents were Jacob and Maria Thorpe. Jacob came with his two brothers from the state of New York. Asa had come on a trip to Washington Island to cooper for a number of the fishermen. Now, coopering was barrel making, and the coopers were in great demand because the fishermen, of course, were getting large catches of fish, and they needed a container to put their product in to send it to market. Thus, the coopering job and the barrel making. Asa met Increase on one of his coopering trips. Increase, of course, was Maria's father, which, of course, is the combination here, Jacob and Maria Thorpe. And Increase was the very first pioneer on the Door County Peninsula, coming first to Little Sturgeon, and then that in 1835, and then coming on to Fish Creek in 1844. Asa had convinced his brothers to come to Fish Creek to help him build a dock. So Jacob came, helped Brother Asa build the dock, did some coopering for Increase, meeting Maria, marrying her, and thus the Claflin-Thorpe connection. Jacob and Maria had 5 children, Roy being the eldest, followed by Mary, Freeman, Emma, and Lily. Now, Roy and his first wife, Matilda Thorpe, married in 1877. Roy and Matilda also had 5 children, and they were May, Bertha, Pearl, Merle, and Grace. Merle, I think, was the youngest, pardon me. Unfortunately, Matilda died in 1892 after a very short illness. Roy and I were married September 29, 1894, by a very good friend and Justice of the Peace, Samuel Churches, within the village of Fish Creek. Now, I had 2 very good friends by the name of Annie also. So we each took our husband's first names and put them after our first names. I was Annie Roy, and my 2 very good friends were Annie Carl and Annie Pat. And we all lived on the west end of Fish Creek, so that's how they kept us separated. Now, there was always a race on Monday morning to see who could get her wash on the line first and clear up the noon dishes so we could get together and quilt and hook rugs, because that's what we really love to do. In the spring of 1896, we all attended a masquerade ball, and the 3 of us went as a trio of flower girls. Now, the ball was in the ballroom on top of the Fish Creek General Store, and we caused quite a stir. All of us danced until dawn. My husband Roy spent most of his boyhood in the village of Egg Harbor. He was the first child to be born in that community. Once of age, he purchased land in Jacksonport, which he proceeded to clear for farming. After 7 years, he sold the farm and returned to Fish Creek to fish. One of Roy's fishing stories is recorded in the Door County Democrat. Now remember, the Democrat was the precursor to the Door County Advocate. It begins to tell the story that Roy had set his nets off the south end of Cottage Row. And it was spring, the ice was beginning to melt, the catches of fish were good, so Roy held off pulling his nets. Each day he would walk out to the nets, pulling a small sled loaded with wood fish boxes. One morning, he fell through the ice. Each time he struggled to pull himself back out onto a more solid shelf of ice, the ice gave way and he fell back into the very, very frigid water. After much thrashing about, he began to yell for help. Sherman Kinsey, hunting in the woods nearby, heard his cries and ran to assist him. He pulled him out immediately, and as the Democrat quoted, "more dead than alive," rushed him home, wrapped him in blankets, and set him next to a very hot fire. And of course, we assume gave him something medicinal for his insides to warm him up. Roy was most grateful to Sherman, and as the Democrat quoted, owes Mr. Kinsey a debt of gratitude for his timely assistance rendered. Roy was also a very good sailor. The following story comes from his grandson, Duncan Thorpe. One day, a sleek new boat from Sturgeon Bay pulled into the town dock, sporting a broom in its rigging. Now that is a symbol of a clean sweep of all its competitors. After lengthy discussion, it was learned that indeed this craft had outsailed a number of other boats known for their speed and their canny skippers. Soon a wager was staked that a boat from Fish Creek could outsail this craft on a course from the town dock west around Chambers Islands, testing both boats on headwinds, crosswinds, and fair winds, as the sailors say. Betting was hot, and large sums of money were laid out on both sides. The challenger was my husband, Roy Thorpe, skippering a lean sloop built by the Weberg boys. The contenders rounded Chambers Island to the north, which made it necessary to swing wide to avoid the 2-mile rock reef that ran out from the northeast point of the island. The Fish Creek boat lost half a mile lead on this lake. As they approached the reef, Roy took a range on 2 very high pines on the north shore of the Fish Creek harbor, and sailing by the seat of his pants, zipped through a cut in the reef with inches, they say 6 inches, to spare under his centerboard. The shortcut gave him a lead he never lost, and the skipper from the Sturgeon Bay boat took an extra 3 miles to round the reef in safety. Reaching in a beam wind, both boats returned to the town dock, and bets were paid. An excited group of locals said, "You boys take that damn broom down now." In 1910, Roy purchased 40 acres of land east of the town of Fish Creek, and he proceeded to develop a splendid fruit orchard of 1,500 apple trees, 1,500 cherry trees, and 2,000 gooseberry and currant bushes. We lived downtown in a house just across the street from the Church of the Atonement. He was considered a leading fruit grower in the township of Gibraltar, a strong Democrat at the polls, and as chairman of the town board, convinced the board to exchange a road running through the middle of the Friedman property for what is now Sunset Beach Park. And that is how we have in our community that beautiful park. He was postmaster for 14 years, a member of the school board for 30 years, was a member of Modern Woodsmen of America, which was a logging group at that time. Now it is an insurance company. And he also was a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church. In late years, and this is my last story, Roy had an old horse by the name of Old Frank. It was a black gelding, he called it. Now, Old Frank was kind of an unusual character. He loved the vegetables in my garden, especially the corn. When Old Frank reached the age of 30, and they say that's old for a horse, Roy used him, of course, to haul wood poles from our woods to the house. Well, when Old Frank reached the age of 30, he started to go on strike. When the load of wood poles got just so high in the cart, Old Frank would give a snort, heave a sigh, and lie down on his belly. Now, no coaxing, cursing, or pulling at him would get him to stand up on his feet again. Finally, Roy would walk back to the cart, unload 2 or 3 of the poles last loaded, and old Frank would look at him, get up, and walk briskly home to the woodpile, having won the argument. Following is a quote from Holen's History of Door County, Volume 2. Quote, Roy had a wide range of friends, and his genuine worth was attested by the fact that those who knew him the longest held him in the warmest regard, unquote. Thank you.
Kan du glemme gamle Norge? Aldri jeg deg glemme kan. Med det stolte klippeborger, du mine fedres land. Kan du glemme Norgeskogen, med de furu, berg og gran? Kan du glemme sjøens våve, vil du da forglemme alt. La de da din tanke svove, det kan aldri falle tomt. Må for nordmann lenge leve, gamle Norge evig ungt.